This story begins with a lawyer, actually a public defender, who was sitting at his desk in the late 70s when a small man, about 5 foot 4 inches tall, was shown into his office. He introduced himself as Muru, possibly Meru. He had a dark complexion, described as being like an Arab. He was dressed in a typical business suit, white shirt, and black tie. When asked what he was there for, he replied that he was to provide information. Beyond that, all questions were evasive and quite irritating to the lawyer. For the purpose of this story, I will simply refer to this lawyer as Bill. After a few minutes, Meru left, stating he would be back. And return he did, several times over the next couple of months. Always evasive, always cordial, and always frustrating. Finally, during one of his unannounced visits, Meru told Bill to meet him at a deserted farm field about 12 miles outside of town. Not a problem, except he wanted the meeting to take place at 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning, and he was to come alone. Bill indicated there was no way he was meeting this stranger on a lonely road in the wee hours of the morning. Meru just smiled and said, "You'll be there." Well, this invitation set off a buzz in the office, as by now everyone was in on the story and terribly curious about the little man who kept dropping in. After lengthy discussions, a plan was hatched, where Bill's law partner would be standing by all night, and if Bill did not return by an agreed-upon time, he would bring in law enforcement. So the day arrived, and Bill prepared himself with the appropriate measures, which included taking along his .357 Magnum pistol. He had pulled a tour in Vietnam and was not terribly uncomfortable in risky situations. He arrived several hours early to the site and completely scouted out the field, surrounding fence lines and brush and tree areas. All was quiet, so he returned to his car and awaited the 2 a.m. hour. He was kind of nodding off when he heard a sharp rapping on his driver's side window. Instinctively, he grabbed his pistol and had it pointing at the window as he turned his head. There was Meru. As Bill rolled down the window, Meru told him the firearm was a waste of effort and invited Bill to get out of the car and follow him. Bill took a quick glance at his watch, confirming that it was 2 a.m. As he started to follow Meru, Bill was astonished by where they were going. Right in the center of the pasture was a large columned building. It looked like something you would find in Greece, not in the mountains of Utah. As he walked towards the steps of the building, Bill looked back and saw himself still in the car. A strange eeriness crept through his thoughts, but he decided if he had come this far, he might as well see it through. So they climbed the steps and entered the formidable door into the building. They entered into a large hall. It had high ceilings and seemed to be about 100 feet square. Scattered on the floor were hundreds of large, multicolored pillows. He was told this was a classroom or learning area, and he could see several small groups focusing on a central figure, probably a teacher of some sort. Next, he was taken to another area, where a pendulum-type device was anchored to the very tall domed ceiling of the room. It was a heavy ball suspended on a long cord, or wire, and was swinging back and forth over an unusual geometry embedded in the floor. He was told that this was not a pendulum for measuring Earth's rotation, such as found in some large museums, but rather a device for measuring epochs of time. One other place he was shown was a room that had a field of energy separating it from the rest of the building. Within the room, he could see a table with 13 chairs, 6 on each side and 1 at the head. He was told only those who were, quote-unquote, worthy could enter this place. Always one with a high self-image, Bill decided to see if he was worthy. The force field knocked him for a loop. With a little more humility, he began asking questions about what was being shown and why. He was told that this was a learning center, built by an advanced team of a group of beings who had lived on the Earth in the distant past and were returning soon. They were teaching those of humankind that chose to listen of the vast information we have not been allowed to have on a 3D level. This speaks to the intentional withholding of the information from the masses by a privileged elite. The huge gaps in the earthly educational processes was being filled in at this facility. A sampling of the truths that were being taught were ideas like the humanoid form is universal and found throughout the cosmos. Not everyone walking on Earth was born on this planet. Not everyone born on this planet continued to live here. A few are now living on other worlds. These beings were here because of a major set of events that were about to transpire on this planet. Many other things were shared with Bill during this first of many visits to the cow pasture. Some were totally logical, but many of the revelations made little sense, and still don't as of this writing. Bill left the building and started to walk back to his car with Muru. The next thing he knew, he was jolted awake. He looked at his watch. It was still reading 2, even though there was a hint of dawn in the eastern sky. He turned on the car radio and found that it was actually a little after 5:30 a.m. As he drove down the canyon, he sorted through the incredible night and the missing 3.5 hours. If it was a dream, why did his watch stop? When he was back in the city, he checked in with his law partner and went home to contemplate and sleep. As you can imagine, there was a lot of office talk about all of the details of what happened at the cow pasture. Some people at the office had seen Muru during his unscheduled visits and were caught up in the story. A plan was hatched to have one of the secretaries follow him the next time he dropped by. Sure enough, he showed up as usual, and the secretary positioned herself outside on the busy sidewalk. A few minutes later, she saw Muru emerge from the office building. He began walking down the sidewalk, just as a movie theater matinee crowd was walking the opposite direction. As the astonished secretary watched, he simply vanished. The movie crowd stopped a moment, looked bewildered, and then shook it off and continued to their transportation. In the middle of the afternoon, on the busy sidewalk of a busy street in the downtown office district of a small city, surrounded by people, while being followed, Muru just disappeared. It was evident by now that this story was getting more and more unusual, but it was far from over. Late one evening, a few months later, Bill was entertaining a lady friend in the second-floor loft of a condo. They heard someone down on the main floor, so he went over to the rail to see what was going on. There stood Muru. Bill had no explanation for how he got into the room, as the doors and windows were locked. He was somewhat exasperated, as he had a romantic evening in full swing, and asked Muru to leave. Instead, Muru told him to go pick up a specific psychiatrist and meet him at the cow pasture at 2 a.m. It was approaching midnight when he showed up. Bill told him there was no way. It was a cold winter night. The psychiatrist would not come, and he had better things to do. Muru smiled and simply informed him he would be there, and was gone. Curiosity and the plain weirdness of the circumstances got the best of Bill. He made the call to the psychiatrist, whom he knew casually from the professional overlaps with clients. After several questions about drinking, recent headaches, drugs, and delusions, a reluctant agreement to go with him to the cow pasture was formed. So, at about 1 a.m., Bill arrives at the psychiatrist's house to find the whole family up and wanting to check out the crazy guy who was taking their husband and father on a ride to nowhere in the middle of the night. The drive up to the cow pasture could best be described as a psychiatric intake session, as Bill tried to explain the bizarre trail of events leading up to this late-night foray. At 2 a.m., they pulled off the main highway and onto the side road leading to the cow pasture. There was about 2 feet of snow covering the landscape, and the temperature was well below zero. They parked and looked out across the surreal winter landscape. They could not see anyone, and as they waited in the car, most of the conversation was about mental health. Then the psychiatrist pointed to a man illuminated in the moonlight and standing about 150 feet away in the cow pasture. Bill recognized him as Muru, although they could not figure out how he got there. Bill decided to go talk with him because he had been skiing earlier that day, so was dressed for the cold. The psychiatrist decided to stay in the car, where he could start it occasionally to stay warm if the meeting took very long. So Bill walked out to greet Muru. and as he approached in the deep powdery snow, there was only one trail leading out into the field. His. Muru went through his normal communication procedure. He provided all the pertinent information for the evening, then reverted to the same old evasiveness. Bill was freezing and indicated he had to go. Muru agreed, but said he had something he wanted Bill to take with him. He reached down into the ground and pulled up a big ball of muddy earth. It was about the size of a basketball and just a glob of wet, sticky mud, even though everything in the winter landscape was frozen solid by the well below freezing temperatures. He handed it to a reluctant Bill and said something to the effect of, "To find what is important, wash away the mud so only the truth remains." So Bill started back to the car, and when he looked back, Muru was gone. Bill opened the passenger door and gave the reluctant psychiatrist the ball of mud to hold on to the trip home. The conversation going back to the city was a comparison of notes and a futile search for an explanation of the strangeness of the night's events. You see, the psychiatrist had heard all of the conversation taking place out in the cow pasture, even though he had stayed in the car with the windows up and the motor running to stay warm. Upon arriving back at the home of the psychiatrist, all of the family was still up and stared in disbelief as their father and husband walked in carrying a large ball of mud. His wife made him go down to the basement, where he placed it in a sink and began to sift through the mud ball. First a coin, then small metal plates, then some more coins, an amulet, and a bracelet came into view as the family and Bill sifted through the clump of soil. The atmosphere resembled Christmas morning for those participating at the 3 a.m. plus unveiling. Little did the excited group realize how involved their life would be with these strange objects over the coming years. Rather than try to chronological the rest of the story, I will just hit a number of the interesting highlights. There was a great interest in the origins of the coins that were in the mud ball. They were shown to a number of coin experts and dealers, and no one could identify where they had been minted. A similar problem developed relating to the two small inscribed metal plates. No one could identify the language in which they were written, let alone any type of translation. The local university professors were baffled as well. Then, a few months later, Bill's law partner was walking by a small downtown bookstore and was drawn in. By now, he automatically browsed the metaphysical shelves, and as he did, an obscure book caught his attention. It was written by James Churchward about the Lemurian civilization. Churchward was a British Army officer stationed in India in the 1860s who was shown some ancient temple records. When he thumbed through the pages, he was startled to see the exact symbology that was stamped into the mysterious coins. He rushed back to tell Bill, and they favorably compared the symbols from Muru with the coins, and the amulet or talisman was found to be an exact match. The inscribed metal plates were later translated by Muru during one of his visits. They were a brief history of a traveling trade group who had spent the winter in the valley where the cow pasture was located far more than 10,000 years earlier. They were following an ancient inner valley trade route that I have since successfully identified and traced for more than 500 miles. It was learned that when one placed the talisman on the forehead and relaxed, all sorts of visions would begin pouring into the brain. Many of these visions were found to be prophetic in nature. Always curious about the cause, Bill made arrangements for the coin or talisman to be spectro-analyzed by some technicians at the Tykal Corporation. After the analysis, which determined it was an alloy of a variety of metals with silver and gold predominant, one of the technicians decided he was going to keep the amulet. He told Bill it had been stolen, which greatly upset Bill, but there was not much he could do. A couple of weeks later, during a visit by Muru, the topic of the missing amulet was never addressed. As he was leaving, Muru casually mentioned the amulet would be returned soon. An embarrassed and startled Bill didn't know how to respond. 2 days later, Bill got an angry and panicked call from the technician who had stolen the coin. He screamed at Bill to come get the cursed amulet. He was in the local hospital, totally blind and scared out of his wits. Bill drove to the hospital and retrieved the talisman. The man was totally blind, much to the consternation of the doctors. When Bill followed up with the man a week or so later, his eyesight had returned to normal. During the efforts to identify the writing and coinage sources, one of the universities contacted was Duke University. At that time, they had a department of paranormal studies. When they heard the details of the coins and plates and the background, they gave one of their professors a grant of $100,000 to go to Utah and investigate the entire event that was transpiring. He spent 2 years investigating full-time, and I met with him on several occasions. One of the interesting pieces of information he provided was the fact that Duke University had received inquiries about coins with the same writing on them from 3 other locations around North America within a period of less than a year. The decision to research the Utah site was because of the credibility and massive amount of verifiable details of the overall story. Before I relate some of the events his research unveiled, I want to mention that when his grant money from Duke ran out after 2 years, he secured a professorship at Weber State College so that he could continue the research into the Muru story. One of the anomalies he discovered was that there was a particular strip of ground about 75 yards from the Muru Invisible Building site that had a rash of paranormal reports. The area is extensively used for recreational activities, and the people were getting a little more than they bargained for. They were hearing voices talking around them when there was not a person around. They reported feeling someone touching them when they were verifiably alone. These activities sometimes occurred in small groups, as well as with just individuals. The Duke professor validated over 20 such first-hand reports in just his first 2 years of investigation. I heard of these goings-on, so I suggested to my most skeptical friend that we should have to check them out ourselves sometime. However, one day he talked to his father, who was a geophysics scientist for one of the international oil companies, into bringing him some instruments to test the invisible temple site. They had not been on location more than a few minutes when they began to hear the talking. The 3 of them attempted to identify the source of the talking for over an hour and a half. They followed the sound source over a quarter mile. They all described it as sounding like a radio station that is not quite tuned into the peak signal. They could sometimes make out words, and other times it was in some unknown language. Darkness eventually ended the adventure. They described the experience as always sounding like the sound was coming from right over there. They would go there, and then it was just a little further over there. They all agreed on the direction, but found nothing. Over the years, a number of people were curious enough to make the drive to visit the cow pasture. Myself, I have visited at least 20 times over the years, in the middle of the day and middle of the night, 2 a.m. to be precise. A couple of things all these visits sometimes have in common should be mentioned. First, there seems to be times of high energy and other times when nothing happens. For instance, normally one can drive a vehicle down the dirt road to the cow pasture and back with no problem. But sometimes wild things happen, like the vehicle will suddenly lose all electrical functions and quit. By pushing it back a little ways, it will again start. If this is nighttime, the headlights will go out, but come back on when some invisible line is crossed when pushing it back. Sometimes there are random electrical events, like the horn honking, or windshield wipers turning on, or the radio begins playing when off. A couple of times people have been walking out into the empty cow pasture in the middle of the day, only to bump into something solid, It cannot be seen, but it can be felt. They have even felt their way around a large invisible object, parked in the middle of the empty field. They will return a little later, and the object will be gone, and everything returned to normal. Second, there seems to be periods of time when the ground is sometimes storing energy. When a person visits the pasture during one of these windows, the experience is described as an electrical earthquake. There are intense electrical pulses radiating up through the feet. It makes a person very unstable, sometimes resulting in not being able to walk. Their legs will simply cease working, and they will collapse to the ground. On occasion, people have to be carried out of the energized area before they can stand again. Kind of like the vehicles cross some imaginary line, and things return to normal. This seems to vary quite widely from person to person. Some will be affected much more than others. It is unknown why. Muru once made mention that some type of energy is being offloaded and stored for future use when this activity is taking place. The ground seems to dissipate the energy in a few hours because the effect rapidly returns to the normal.
So, I have every reason to believe that this is a real location. Welcome to my treasure hunt. This is a search for a real location that someone out there has to know about. This story I originally got as an email from a man named Robert Shrewsbury, and he spent his life just looking for treasure and fun and mystical stuff in Utah. And Terry Carter, I'm looking at you because this is also up your alley. Everyone knows somebody who knows something about this location. There are clues in this email about its whereabouts, so it's 12 miles outside of a town. However, he said that this was popular in the 60s or 70s, so maybe it's less than 12 right now out of a town. There's an area where you can go skiing and come back in less than a day. There is a law firm next to a movie theater. There is a downtown that has a bookstore. And I don't know how much that narrows it down, but I'm trying really hard to find this location. I don't believe it's been built on, because a place that important, the government or whoever is going to find a way for it not to be built on. It's probably a state park or attached to a state park or a national park or something like that. Robert actually went there in the 70s. He said it was before GPS, so he wasn't sure where. He did give me a city. The city is nowhere near Skinwalker Ranch. Sorry to hurt your feelings. He said a man took him there, and he gave me the man's name, and I dug up and found out that this man is a professor at ASU, and he is not responding to my emails. So I'm gonna go to his office in a few weeks and see if I can talk to him in person. And that other professor, I want to know more about him too. So somebody moved from North Carolina to Utah, and I want to know his name. I want to know where he was, what he was experiencing. He had to have written books or journals about the work he was doing. And about the gold coins, they were all pictures from all of these books that I bought. And I don't know exactly what symbols were on the coins, but I would like to know where the coins are now. Lastly, all the images that were in the story I made with AI, and that was such a pain. That is not easy. Getting all the images consistent and for 21 minutes, that was kind of a nightmare. I'd like to thank Lance Lovegood for reading this story, and I'd like to dedicate this to the late, the great, the amazing Robert Shrewsbury. We miss you.